Good morning. It's my absolute delight and great pleasure to welcome everyone to this inaugural Balsillie Lecture. The annual Balsillie Lecture hosts distinguished colleagues and writers whose work influences thinking on critical challenges to humanity. The speaker is an outstanding international personality who, in significant and innovative ways, contributes to a more just, peaceful, and environmentally sustainable world through valuable achievements in politics or research. Before I turn the floor over to Mr. Jim Balsillie, founder of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, to officially launch the event and to introduce today's distinguished guest, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. One of the actions we take at the Balsillie School to advance reconciliation between settler and Indigenous peoples is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization that deeply impacts our work. We are proud to acknowledge that the Balsillie School is situated on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It is particularly important that we here at the school acknowledge the land upon which we are situated in all that we do, including today's important event. It is now my distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome Mr. Jim Balsillie, Canadian businessman, philanthropist, and the generous founder of the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Jim, we are delighted to have you here with us today to open this important event and to introduce our eminent Balsillie lecturer. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne, and good morning, and welcome everyone to the first annual Balsillie Lecture. As one of Canada's leading centres for the study and teaching of international affairs and global governance, the school seeks answers and resolutions to the crises and problems affecting humanity across the globe today. So I'm pleased to see you all playing such an active and constructive role in informing relevant debates. As we face the unpredictability and uncertainty of our present challenges, we must chart the path forward by undertaking critical, careful, and thoughtful analyses of the past. This is done in part by listening and learning from those whose knowledge and experience has navigated us through past challenges. It is in this spirit that the school has started this annual lecture, a platform for both Canadian and global thought leaders to offer lessons and insights into the complex dynamics that make up our local, national, and global worlds. It is my great pleasure today to officially open the inaugural lecture, especially since it's being delivered by one of the world's most noted and celebrated historians, a Canadian who excels in extracting lessons and insights from the past in order to outline a future of progress, hope, and peace. She has eloquently expounded and revealed striking and illuminating lessons on our shared human condition, on who we are and what we can accomplish together. I am honored to welcome Professor Margaret MacMillan, Emeritus Professor of International History at the University of Oxford, the distinguished historian at the Council of Foreign Relations, and author of numerous influential books, including The War That Ended Peace, The Road to 1914, Dangerous Games, The Uses and Abuses of History, and of course, her most recent book that focuses on today's lecture, War, How Conflict Shaped Us. Educated at the Universities of Toronto and Oxford, Professor MacMillan was a member of Ryerson University's History Department for 25 years, provost of Trinity College at the University of Toronto from 2002 to 2007, warden of St. Antony's College and professor of international history at the University of Oxford from 2007 to 2017. She was also the Xerox Foundation Distinguished Scholar at the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins SAIS, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and a Companion of the Order of Canada. It is wonderful to host Professor MacMillan today at this very special inaugural lecture, the first of a series that I and the Balsillie School of International Affairs hope will continue for years to come. There is no better way to celebrate our resilience in these challenging times and to articulate the hope and possibility of the future than by turning to someone so skilled in analyzing how our past shapes lessons, knowledge, and hope for future thinkers, including the students. Margaret, I warmly welcome you to our school. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction indeed, and it's a great pleasure to be taking part in the inaugural lecture particularly. I feel very honored indeed. And I think what you've done here in setting up a School of International Affairs is very important, because I think we all know how important it is to understand the world in which Canada must survive and interact. Joanne and I talked about, Anne and I rather talked about how we were going to do this, and we agreed that I wouldn't do a formal lecture because I think that is difficult on Zoom. And so Anne is going to ask me what I hope are not too difficult questions.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I'm delighted to be moderating today. I'd like to start by asking you why we have war and whether this is something to do with human nature.
You've asked me probably one of the most difficult questions about war, on which there are a great many debates. And the debate is, on the one hand, that we are somehow condemned to war because it's something in our nature, that we have been programmed as a result of evolution and our own biology to want to fight. And that's one extreme, if you like, of the debate. And the other is that, no, we're not necessarily programmed to want to fight. We have certain instincts, of course. We often have certain fears. We often lash out when we're frightened, but that it is more a question of culture. And I tend to come down on the side of culture. War is not random violence. War is highly organized violence. It is one organized group against another organized group. An organized group which has some shared values, some shared aims. Those could be religious, they can be territorial, they can be tribal, they can be, like my own MacMillan ancestors, clans holding together. But it's the organization and it's the application of violence through organization that makes war very different from random violence. And so I think when we look at the long history of war, we see that it's deeply embedded in societies and the ways in which societies think about themselves, and the ways in which societies mobilize themselves in order to fight. It takes actually a lot of training and a lot of inculcating of warlike values to make people who want to fight. Because if we have, and I think it's probably true as a result of evolution, developed a tendency to lash out when we're frightened. I mean, if you look at our closest cousins in the animal world, the chimpanzees and the bonobo, the chimpanzees do tend to lash out when they're afraid. If a chimpanzee from another band comes into their territory, they will use violence against that chimpanzee. And so we possibly have that in our makeup. I mean, the chimpanzees are very close cousins, but we also have those other close cousins, the bonobo, who look rather like chimpanzees, but behave very differently. And if a stranger comes into their midst, they welcome that stranger. And so I think we have within us both these violent impulses, but also these altruistic impulses. And I think it could be argued that our altruistic and our communal impulses are often stronger than those that would lead us towards violence. And so why is it then that we fight in organized ways? And I think if we look at the ways through history in which societies have had to make people want to fight, it's not a natural thing to want to do, to get out there and risk your own life and be prepared to kill someone else. And yet people, mainly men, and we can perhaps talk about that later, why it's mainly men, have done this down through the centuries. And so what is it that turns people into those who would like to fight? And I think it's training and it's inculcation of cultural values. I mean, there really are cultures that inculcate military virtues, inculcate a willingness to die for a cause, inculcate a willingness to kill others, inculcate the sort of discipline and the group solidarity that you need if you're going to fight. The other, I think, very uncomfortable thing about why we have war is that it seems to be the case that the more organized we got and the more settled we got as a species, the more we were likely to fight each other. When we were largely nomads, hunter-gatherers, we tended to move around a lot. There was certainly violence. I mean, the evidence, which archaeologists are constantly uncovering, is that even hunter-gatherers had levels of violence and often killed each other, but it tended to be one-on-one. If they were threatened, either by dangerous predatory animals or threatened by other bands of hunter-gatherers, they could always move away. But it was when we became settled, maybe 12,000 years ago, we settled down and became agriculturalists. We had more that could be taken, and we had more that we wanted to defend, and it was much more difficult to move away. And so what we seem to have seen, and of course the further back you go in history, the more difficult it is sometimes to get the evidence, but what seems to be the case is that once we settled down and began to organize ourselves into larger and larger social groups, we also began to fight. Some of the very early human settlements had walls around them. And again, archaeologists have found mass burials of people who look like they've suffered the sort of trauma that you'd suffer in a battle. And so the more we got organized and the more settled we got, the more we tended to fight. And of course, if you were good at fighting, if you were organized enough to fight, you could probably take your neighbors over. And so you could expand your territories. And so the growth of strong, cohesive, organized societies with strong central government seems to have gone hand in hand with the ability to make war. And of course, the better we got and the more we at making war and the more we needed to make war, the more organized we got. And so my argument, I'm sorry, I've gone on a bit long here, but my argument is that it's something we've learned to do, but it is something that goes back a long way into human history.
So we hear lots in the literature and in the arguments about the involvement of both state and non-state actors in war and conflict. What are the sort of reasons why organized groups, from gangs to states, fight?
Well, I would put them into really three categories, and we can think of variants, and these categories often overlap, but one category clearly is fear. You're afraid that someone is going to do something to you, those you love, take your possessions, perhaps take your families and make them slaves or kill them. And so you fight because you're frightened. Sometimes you can see the enemy coming and you have to choose what to do, either to submit or to fight. And often people have chosen to fight. Sometimes you do what is called preemptive strikes or preemptive war, when you attack someone else because you fear they're about to attack you, as say the Japanese did with the Americans at Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese by 1941 had become convinced that the United States was going to block them at every turn, if necessary, by declaring war on Japan. And so the Japanese decided to strike first out of fear, because they feared what the Americans were planning. Fear is one very powerful motive. Greed is another. You want something that someone else has. And we can see this through history. You want land, you want captives, you want gold, you want treasures, you want something, and you're going to use it, use violence if necessary to get that something. And the third category is what I haven't got the right word for it, but it's sort of ideology. It's the ideas that motivate people either who want to build a better society here on Earth, they have a vision of a utopia, or they want to get eternal life and live in the afterlife. And so ideologies, which include religions in this sense, I think can be enormously powerful. People have fought and died for all the major world religions. People have fought and died for ideologies such as nationalism or communism. These have been very powerful motivating forces. And often you'll find that these three different motivations, fear, greed, and ideology, will overlap. And so, for example, the Crusaders on the First Crusade went off into the Middle East from Europe in order to recover the Holy Land from the Muslims, but they certainly did a lot of looting along the way. They saw it as an opportunity. So, being human beings, I think our motives are often mixed. But those are the three categories I'd use. None of them lead to anything pretty. War is dreadful in all circumstances, but perhaps the worst wars of all are the wars for ideology. Because if you want to build a paradise either on Earth or in the afterlife, anyone who stands in your way should be eliminated. And that can lead to unending and open-ended cruelty.
In your book, you explore the relationship between war and society. Please, could you elaborate on the relationships and the benefits and positive impacts of war?
First of all, the relationship, which is a very important one, I think. And we can see that societies that were successful at fighting tended to be successful because they were good at mobilizing what they needed to fight. And but just to go back to my point about the organization of war, when you think of just how organized you need to be to find the people who are going to fight, you have to train them, you have to make sure they have the weapons, you have to make sure that they have the equipment they need, and you have to make sure they can get to where they're going, and you probably have to make sure that somehow you can keep them supplied and keep them fed. And that takes, of course, the bigger the armed forces, incredible organization. I mean, the organization that it took in the First World War in that first month of August 1914 to send something like 6 million men, plus their horses, plus their guns, plus their equipment, on trains into the battlefields. I mean, we just have to think what that would take. And so to be able to do that, governments found themselves having to become more organized. And a lot of scholars have argued the appearance of strong, powerful central governments in Europe in early modern history and elsewhere in the world was very much dependent upon the capacity of those governments to use military force. And so the more military force governments were able to build, of course, the more control they were able to get over society. And so gradually, kings began to build their own armies and began to bring the unruly nobles, the feudal lords who sat in their castles, under control. And once they'd got them under control, then, of course, the central government had yet more power. Governments also learnt to find out what they had. And so the origin of a lot of the modern passion for statistics came from the need to make war. Governments by the 19th century were realizing that they had to count how many people they had. Because if you want to know how many possible soldiers you have to know how many men you have of military age. Governments began to have to improve their taxation systems because war is very expensive. One of the reasons the British developed a very strong navy was that they had a very good system of taxing and borrowing money from the British public. If they hadn't been able to do that, they wouldn't have been able to pay for the navy, which was enormously expensive. But the better the British got, it's sort of chicken and egg. It's very hard to say which comes first, but the better the British got at extracting resources from their society to build strong armed forces, the more they were able to get those resources. And so governments that became efficient were the ones that were going to survive. And so the organization of society and government have really gone, I think, hand in hand with the capacity to make war. And of course, the stronger you get, the more you can control your society. Governments also began to realize that if they wanted to have effective soldiers, and this was particularly true by the 19th century, they needed people who could read and write. And so this spurred public education. And then they began to realize that if they wanted to have good soldiers, they needed people who were healthy. And so a lot of the impetus behind public health measures, getting better water, for example, came from governments who were dismayed at the low quality of the soldiers they were getting. And so some of the preparations for war began to have a beneficial impact on society. And then there's what war itself does. And what war does, particularly if it's war on a very large scale, is what it will do is oblige societies to do things that they wouldn't do in peacetime, to spend money in ways they wouldn't spend in peacetime. Other great catastrophes can do that as well. And I think we're seeing this very much during this current pandemic. You know, if you had said to most people, including politicians or leaders of any sort, or to the general public a year ago, governments are going to have to spend an awful lot of money to support people who don't have jobs and keep them home. They're going to have to spend an awful lot of money to prop up societies. People would have said, we can't afford it. We can't possibly do it. Well, we've been doing it. Suddenly, governments are realizing they have to spend money on a scale if they are to avoid complete economic collapse. And governments around the world have invested heavily in pharmaceuticals, heavily in research. Again, I think if you'd said a year ago, we need an awful lot of research into developing vaccines against possible pandemics, people would have said, no, it's, we can't possibly afford that. Well, we can. And that's what happens in war. Governments begin to spend on a scale which they don't spend in peacetime, and they often make huge advances as a result of that spending in things such as science and technology. A lot of the advances in medicine in the 20th century, just to give one example, were made because of what people found out in war. I'll give an example I often give, and that's penicillin. Very close to where I live in Oxford, there's a sign on a wall, a historic plaque, which says, on this site in 1941, the first person was treated successfully with penicillin. Now, we take antibiotics such as penicillin for granted, but they have saved literally millions of lives. It was considered too expensive to make penicillin before the Second World War. It had been discovered at least 10 years before, too expensive. The war came and suddenly it wasn't expensive anymore. And so wars will speed up developments in science and technology, including in medicine, which will often have beneficial effects in peacetime. And what wars can also do is bring about massive social change. The two world wars produced societies in which the divisions between the very rich and the poor were compressed. They produced much more equal societies in many countries, partly because during the war the rich got taxed more heavily and governments realized they had to pay those at the lower levels of society better or they wouldn't support the war effort. And so some of the greatest equality we've known in societies around the world came as a result of the two world wars in the 20th century. And changes in the position of groups, such as the lower classes, the working classes, have often been pushed ahead because of war. Labor gained enormously, both in the sort of wages that laboring people were getting, but also in their capacity to form unions. The British government brought in the welfare state at the end of the Second World War, very much in recognition that the ordinary men and women of Britain had contributed hugely to the war effort and they were owed something. Now, we wouldn't make those changes, or we shouldn't make those changes just because of war, and we don't need a war to make such changes, but often war does oblige us or push us in the direction of making changes. And one final example I'll just give you, and that is that women who had been asking for greater rights, including the vote before the First World War, in many cases weren't getting very far with it. By the time the First World War had ended in a number of countries, Britain for one, governments had recognized that women had shown that they could participate in the war effort very much as the equals of men, and therefore they couldn't be denied the vote. And so war, and I keep stressing, is not a good thing. It's a dreadful thing, but it can sometimes bring unintended benefits that benefit us all in peacetime.
So what makes modern day war so destructive and fought on such a large scale these days?
Modern war, I think, is so destructive, well, partly because of the technology, partly because it is now possible to produce weapons that can kill on a very large scale. I mean, one of the great tragedies of the First World War was that Europe, which was the most advanced industrial power, or center of the world really, most advanced in science and technology, had this extraordinary capacity to produce goods, consumer goods, but also an extraordinary capacity to produce weapons. And the weapons in the course of the 19th century were getting more and more deadly. Not just the range was longer, the explosives were better. It was possible to fire guns that would hit targets 3, 4, 5, 50 miles away. It was possible for someone with a rifle to hit a target 1,000 yards away. And it was possible, of course, with repeating rifles and with machine guns to fire literally hundreds of bullets in a minute. And so it became, unfortunately, the curse of Europe that its very industrial capacity, its very success in science and technology made it extremely efficient at killing. What the Industrial Revolution also did is it produced new means of transportation. And so in the old days, before the 19th century, before the railways and before steamships, soldiers had to march to where they were going. And it was difficult to supply them. They needed horses to bring up food, but the horse, of course, ate a great deal of food itself every day. And so the capacity to put big armies in the field was very limited. And if you put too many men into the field and couldn't feed them, they starved, which is what happened to Napoleon when he invaded Russia in 1812. Huge army, maybe 800,000 men, they couldn't supply them. And a lot of those soldiers never came back from Russia because they starved to death. What the Industrial Revolution made possible was to get people equipped on a very large scale, keep them in the field, move them there with railways, keep moving up the supplies they needed by the railways, which is why the First World War lasted for 4 years, because it was possible now to keep a war going for 4 years. The second thing that began to make war, I think, so big and so terrifying was that societies were becoming more closely knit, and I think people were developing a greater sense of themselves as citizens rather than subjects. So before the 19th century, if you asked most people who they were, they wouldn't say I'm a Canadian or I'm a French citizen or I'm an American. What they would probably say is I live in this village or I live in this town or I belong to this particular clan. Or they might say I'm the subject of Queen Elizabeth or I'm the subject of King William. But they wouldn't see themselves as having any say in the government of their own country. A lot of people didn't even know what the government of their own country did or where it was. What the 19th century did is begin, and again, it's partly because of modern communications, to weld people together into something called the nation. And so people begin to feel themselves citizens. And that means if you're a citizen, you're no longer just subject to someone else. You actually have an active participation. And so people begin to feel, and you can see it across Europe, and you can see it in the United States, you can see it in Canada, they begin to feel we have a say in our government. Once you feel that, of course, you also have an obligation to come to the defense of your government. And so what you get is a very powerful motivating ideology, which coincides with this capacity to make war on a much bigger scale. You have more and more people who think that the war might be a good thing. And so by the time of the 20th century, wars are involving, as I mentioned earlier, literally millions of fighting people, fighting men largely, pretty much all fighting men, but they're also involving societies keeping them there and supporting them. And so societies are drawn in, the factories have to work, the women have to support the men, the women have to go and take the jobs that men were doing, resources have to be commandeered, governments have to assert controls over society. And so what that means, in fact, is war is on such a huge scale, and it's not just the armed forces against each other, it's a whole society against another whole society. And we had to come up with a new word for it. And so we came up with the expression total war. War had become very different. Now, we haven't seen recently large-scale wars of that scale. And I think that is partly because the wars have been fought over smaller areas. They haven't involved the major powers directly fighting each other, although major powers have been involved in wars. And I think we perhaps, and we can perhaps talk about it a bit later on, we also now perhaps have a very healthy respect for the sorts of weapons that we have, which are even more deadly. And so I think we fear what we might do to ourselves if we got into a war these days.
Wars eventually come to an end, and they leave legacies. How should we remember wars, and perhaps why should we study the concept of war?
How we remember wars is a complicated question. We often argue about it, as we do about a lot of our past. You know, in a number of countries around the world today, we're arguing about how we remember the figures of the past, how we remember the incidents of the past. And that's, I think, as it should be. The past is something that we are always looking at with new eyes, and we're always asking new questions. And how we remember wars changes and has changed. Before the First World War, societies didn't remember the ordinary soldiers at all. The ordinary soldiers were buried where they fell. They didn't have gravestones. They didn't have any memorials. They were simply there and forgotten. Officers would get proper tombs. Officers would often be brought back and buried in their own churches, but the ordinary soldiers were not commemorated. And that changed very much as a result of the First World War, because this was such a war of one society against another, and the ordinary soldiers were every bit as important as those who were commanding them. And so we got this notion that everyone who died in the war should be commemorated in some way. But how we remembered the war, it's really interesting. It changes. I mean, right after the First World War, we now remember the First World War, I think. If you ask most people if they know about the First World War, they'd say it was dreadful. It was wasteful. It was pointless. It was a terrible waste of life. Nothing good about it at all. In the 1920s, people, particularly on the winning side, remembered our dead heroes. And they talked about them as our dead heroes. And the early Remembrance Day ceremonies, which of course were mournful because people were mourning the dead, but they were also had an element of triumphalism in them. It was remembering a heroic victory and remembering those who died. And you get still on some of the monuments, they died so that we could be free, these sorts of sentiments. And it was only really by the 1930s that doubts began to creep in, and people said, well, is it really worth remembering it in this way? And perhaps we should remember it as just simply an appalling and dreadful waste of life and of people. And so I think we've shifted how we think about the First World War. And the Second World War had something to do with that, because the Second World War came along and a lot of people began, and I think with reason, to see the Second World War as something that was just. You know, that we were fighting, the Allies were fighting against a monstrous tyranny. And so the Second World War came to be seen more as a just war, which overshadowed the First World War. It came to be seen as the pointless war. Now, how do we remember it today? I think a lot of countries don't really remember their wars very well. In Russia, for example, they hardly talk about the First World War because it contains many painful memories, including, of course, the fact that it led to the Russian Revolution. In Russia, what they remember and they commemorate and they build monuments to, and they've just built a huge cathedral to, is the Second World War. And that is the Great Patriotic War. But that war is also remembered because the government wants it remembered. Somehow how we remember is pressured or pushed in certain directions by governments for their own purposes. And so President Putin makes a great deal about how the Great Patriotic War shows how powerful Russia was and how powerful Russia still is. And so sometimes there's a very political element in how we remember. If you ask my opinion on it, what I'd like to see is a memory of all those who have died in wars, and a memory that crosses borders, to remember not just those on our side. You know, in Canada, what is our side? So many Canadians have come from countries around the world, some of which were enemies of Canada in previous wars, yet their ancestors died in those wars. And I think perhaps we should be trying to remember all those who died on whatever side they were. And interestingly enough, this is beginning to happen a bit in Europe. The French and the Germans and the British have come together to commemorate the dead of the First World War in a way that mourns them all and deplores war. And I think, again, we all have different opinions on how we should remember wars, but my own preference is for remembering the loss of war and pausing, even if we only do it once a year, to just think about the horrors of war, because I think we need to think about war. And I'll just very briefly deal with the second part of your question. I think it's very important that we know about war, partly because it's been such a huge influence on human history and has literally shaped the course of events. I mean, we just have to ask ourselves, what would the world be like if the Soviet Union had won the Cold War? Or what would the world be like if the Ottoman forces had taken over the center of Europe and conquered Vienna, as they came close to doing? It would be a different sort of Europe if it had been under Ottoman rule for a very long time. And so I think we need to know about war because its consequences are so great. But I think we also need to know about war because we don't want to find ourselves slipping into one again. And we may think, oh, it will never happen to us. But we should remember there are wars around the world at the moment. And there has been one war pretty much every year since 1945, somewhere in the world. And millions of people have been killed in those wars, and millions of people have become refugees. And we still face the prospect of more wars in this world. So that's why I think we need to study it and think about it.
And is it something that we can ever get rid of? Can we ever get rid of war?
We have to hope so. We haven't done very well so far. But interesting enough, I think, again, this goes back deep into human history. As long as we've had war in this sense of one organized group against another organized group, we've had attempts to try and limit it, attempts to try and outlaw it, attempts to make rules. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but we have tried to make rules about war and to say, no, you can't fight in this way, you can only fight in that way. The ancient Greeks in the classical world had a rule that you didn't fight during the Olympics and you didn't fight at the shrines of certain gods. I mean, this was just simply not done. And so I think it is possible. In the Middle Ages, the church tried to enforce a rule that you didn't fight on the holy days. You didn't fight on Easter, you didn't fight on Sunday. And they also tried to limit the sort of targets, that civilians were meant to be exempt and priests were meant to be exempt from being targets of war. And we've seen it in the modern age with both the Geneva and the Hague Conventions. The Geneva Conventions, which started out as an attempt to protect the soldiers who were wounded and taken prisoner in war, and also to protect civilians, and the Hague Conventions. And these keep on being elaborated and new ones keep being passed. The Hague Conventions, which have tried to limit the sorts of ways we fight and the sorts of weapons that we can use. And we're still trying to do it. And Canada has played a role in this, a very important role. We've done a lot to try and limit the use of landmines, for example. And so we keep trying, and we keep trying to think of ways to get rid of war altogether. But so far, we haven't quite made it. But I think the attempt must be made.
Margaret, thank you so much for sharing such informed insights from your research. I learned a great deal, as I'm sure the audience did. I would like now to turn to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. The first question I'd like to address is one from Professor Feridun Hamdoulahpour, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Waterloo, who would welcome your views on what is the future of war.
Oh, well, that is a very interesting question indeed. And of course, some of it sounds like science fiction because the technology is developing so fast. And so the sorts of things that are happening in war is that new battlefields are being opened up. And that's happened before. With the invention of the airplane, war moved up into the air. And with the invention of the submarine, war moved beneath the surface of the earth. And a surface of the seas, rather. And what we're seeing now is unfortunately war moving into space, although there have been treaties against that. And we're also seeing war move into cyberspace. And that's a very interesting field. And it's not like conventional war. It won't involve people actually fighting with each other, but it will involve societies trying to use cyberspace and use cyber wars to try and make it impossible for their enemy to carry on. And that could indeed involve loss of life. And if you imagine how much of our modern society depends on the cyber world, you just have to ask what will happen if a cyber attack were to turn off things like power plants and turn off things like the plants that purify water. I mean, there is really, I think, a really frightening new field here, in the military in a number of countries are taking it very seriously indeed. In fact, the Americans now have a special cyber command added to Naval Command and Sea and Air Command and Land Commands, and I can see why they're doing it. What's also happening is the development of new self-guided weapons using artificial intelligence, and these weapons range from tiny drones. I mean, some of the drones are basically, I think, the size of a bumblebee, which can be programmed, which can be directed, but increasingly can program and direct themselves. And they range in size to ones that look just more or less like aircraft, but aircraft that don't have anyone on them, aircraft that don't need pilots anymore. And it's probable now that the next range of fighter planes will not have any pilots. They're too slow. Human beings are now getting too slow. And there's a talk now of a whole range of ships at sea that won't have any crews. What is worrying about this is who controls these weapons as they become more and more sophisticated, as they become more capable of changing in response to changing circumstances. If they encounter resistance, they become more and more capable of dealing with it. At what point do they escape our control? And can you build in controls that there always have to be some human control? There is talk of this, but understandably, the military in a number of countries don't want to see such controls because they're afraid it may hamper their ability to wage war. And so war at one level is moving in this very high-tech, and as I say, almost science fiction way. But I think what we're also going to see is something that looks very much like war that you might have seen in Roman times or Greek times or under the Egyptian Empire, and that is war of people fighting with not very sophisticated weapons, often fighting in not particularly organized bands, often preying on civilians, sometimes indistinguishable perhaps from bandit bands, but sometimes with a purpose. And I think we're going to see those types of wars continue, where the weapons won't be so very sophisticated. In Afghanistan, you have people fighting with Lee Enfield rifles, which are modeled on the rifles that the British Army used in the First World War. And you have people fighting in parts of Africa using machetes. You know, this is not high-tech war, but it's lethal all the same. And so I see in a way war going off on two different levels, the enormously high-tech level and then the grinding, hideous level, which has always been with us.
Margaret, Ambassador Jacqueline O'Neill, Canada's Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security, asks the following question. As you have described so compellingly, women have played key roles in all aspects of war, yet the vast majority of historical texts about it have been written by men. What, if anything, might societies, including military planners and strategists, better understand about war if our understanding of it has been shaped by more women journalists and historians?
It's an interesting question, and I must say I don't know. It's quite true that most of what has been written about war has been written by men, and that's partly because in most societies until the modern age, men were literate and women weren't. There are one or two women, of course now I can't remember her name, there was quite a famous woman thinker on strategy in the early Renaissance, but she was an exception, and for the most part women did not think or write about war. If they did, they simply didn't have the means of getting it down on paper, and it didn't survive. Would it make a difference? I don't know. Again, we have this argument about or discussion about whether women are less likely to want to fight than men, and do they bring a different perspective? And I would say at the moment the jury is out. Traditionally, I would say probably 99.9% of those who fought have been men, down through history and in most societies. But there is evidence of women fighting. It used to be thought that the Amazons, these terrifying women warriors, were a figment of the Greeks' imagination. The Greeks had sort of created them to think what a horror this would be to actually have women fighting who were good at it. And recent archaeological discoveries around the north shore of the Black Sea have found tombs of ancient skeletons which can now be identified, thanks to means of identifying ancient DNA, as women's skeletons. And they are there with what remains clearly of armor, and their bodies bear the marks of having died as a result of trauma. And so it looks like these are women warriors. And there have been a few discoveries like this of Viking women warriors as well. And there have been the examples of women who've disguised themselves as men and fought. I mean, there are enough of those through history. And today, in a number of armed forces around the world, women do have combat roles. Initially, when women went into the armed forces, for example, the Israeli armed forces, it was said that women had the same roles as men. In fact, they didn't at first. They did the support services, they were kept behind the lines, but now they're in combat roles. And in the Second World War, Soviet women fought in the war against the Germans, and they fought as snipers, they fought as fighter pilots, they fought as bomber pilots, they manned artillery batteries. And so women clearly can fight, and women have played other sorts of roles with war. They've often encouraged the men to go off and fight. They've encouraged their sons or their husbands. And, you know, in the First World War, I don't know about Waterloo, but certainly in Toronto, women stood on street corners and gave out white feathers to men who were of military age but not in uniform. And so women have been the cheerleaders for war sometimes. On the other hand, of course, women have often been victims of war, and sometimes in very particular ways. Women have been made captive, and women have often been targets of rape in war. So is there a gender difference here? And I'm not sure. It's certainly true that a lot of peace movements, certainly in the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries, have seen women taking a very prominent role. And so it may be that women do bring a different perspective, but it seems to me the evidence now is mixed. Women have fought, women can fight, women do support war, women do oppose war. I suspect that the involvement of women in war is probably, again, like the involvement of men in war, very much a product of culture. And as cultures change, the relationship will change.
Richard Florison, President and CEO of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, asked the following question. In your book, you conclude that the factors that produce war, greed, fear, ideology, will continue to work among us as they always have. Could you please expand on the impact of climate change on those factors? How might a warming world uniquely contribute to or mitigate against global conflict and war?
I'm afraid that changing climate will probably contribute to war. And we've seen an example of this before, not with warming, but with a sort of mini ice age in the 17th century, when there was a period when there were unexpectedly cold winters, there were floods, crops failed, and war seemed to flourish as people turned on their neighbors and tried to extract what they needed for survival. And I expect we will see the same thing with climate change today and the warming of the planet. And we're already seeing vast numbers of people becoming climate change refugees, people moving, hoping to find food for their crops, hoping to find water for themselves, hoping to find sustenance. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. But I suspect, and I think we're already seeing it, we're going to see conflict over increasingly scarce resources. Water is an obvious one. In certain parts of the world, water is becoming scarcer and scarcer. Rivers are drying up, lakes are drying up. There's a conflict potentially between Egypt and Ethiopia, or between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia because of the Nile. There have already been threatening and belligerent remarks made in Egypt about what will happen if Sudan and Ethiopia try and prevent water coming down the Nile. Because for Egypt, of course, I think I'm right, the vast proportion of its water comes from the Nile. It has very little rainfall every year. And so if that flood of waters coming down the Nile is interrupted, then for Egypt, it's literally a matter of life and death. And I think we're already seeing some of those conflicts beginning to develop. And let us hope they don't turn into war, but they certainly have the potential for it, because people are going to see that they have no alternative. And this, I think, is going to add to some of the pressures in the world for more conflict, unfortunately.
Bill White, a former deputy governor of the Bank of Canada, asks, wars often occur between ascending and descending powers. What features of modern war make war between the US and China less likely?
Yes, well, it's a question, as I'm sure you know, that a great many people are asking, particularly, I suspect, in Washington and Beijing. There is this theory, which has been much promoted by the Belfer Center at Harvard and Graham Allison, of the, I never can say the word, Thucydides trap, which is based on one line from his History of the Peloponnesian Wars, that Sparta feared the growing power of Athens, and therefore war happened. And this has become a theory, and it seems to at least explain some of the tensions between powers, that if a power feels itself to be declining and another power is rising, conflict between the two is likely, because the rising power wants a greater place in the sun, just like Germany did, for example, before the First World War, and the declining power wants to resist that. And so these are particularly difficult and tense times in international transitions. I regard it as an interesting metaphor, perhaps, or an interesting analogy, but I don't see it as predictive. And I think we can find enough examples of powers that felt their power beginning to slip away, actually coming to terms with it. The British and the Americans were coming into potential conflict in the in the New World in the 1890s. The British had dominated South America and Latin America, and the Americans were now the rising power in that region, if not in the world. And there was talk of war between the two over the Venezuela boundary issues. And I think both sides realized in the end this would be foolish. And an accommodation was reached, and the British essentially pulled out, at least strategically, from North and South America, but kept their huge economic and political influence, and the Americans became gradually the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. So I don't think it's necessarily going to lead to war. But in the case of China and the United States, I think we are right to be worried about the tensions between those two countries. It's difficult to know sometimes whether a power is actually declining or rising. These things aren't all linear. You will get a power that goes through a bad patch and then pulls itself together, which the United States has done before, and China certainly has done. And a power may then go through another bad patch. I mean, I think these things can often be more cyclical than linear. What I think is worrying today is there are these points where their interests are butting up against each other. And the South China Sea does worry me because you have heavily armed forces from both sides there. You have the very difficult issue of Taiwan, which the Chinese regard as part of China, and the United States have promised to defend. And that, I think, is difficult. And what always worries me is just an incident happening. I don't think wars always start in a cold and calculated way. I think sometimes they start by accident. And sometimes governments find themselves with circumstances running out of their control and being pushed by their own publics. And so just imagine what might happen if an American ship sinks a Chinese ship or vice versa. And you get public opinion getting excited. You get people saying, we can't let this happen. That's what I worry about as much as any premeditated war.
I've got a question from Professor Margaret Walton Roberts. People need to understand the horror of war in an intimate and visceral way. I remember as a high school student, hearing from a concentration camp survivor, and it made a massive impression on me. How do we do this as the survivors of total war become less and less? How do we make multipolar proxy wars this intimate for people who are removed from them?
I think it's very important, and I think we have to do it through education. And we have to do it through trying, as you encountered, through letting students understand what it means to an individual. If you read about millions being killed, it's almost so on such a vast scale, it's hard to comprehend. But if you read about someone your age, I mean, I think probably the Diary of Anne Frank has done more to make young people aware of the horrors of anti-Semitism and the Nazi genocide than perhaps more quantitative studies. I mean, it's simply on a certain scale, it's very difficult to comprehend what this means for people. And I do think it's important to remind people of what war is like, because too often we tend to glorify it. You know, there are all those video games which are about war and books and movies about war, but they don't often show the really horrible side of war and the people who are badly wounded and the grimness of war and the sudden death of war. And I think we have to bring this home to people. And what concerns me also, of course, is that more and more we have political leaders who've never experienced war. And, you know, for the 50s and 60s, even 70s, Western political leaders and political leaders around the world had often experienced war. And I think if you've been in a war, you tend to be more cautious about starting one again or getting involved in one again. You know, if you talk to the military, they are sometimes the least warlike people I know because they've seen it and they know what it's like. So I think it's a very big question for us as a society.
And related to that topic, there are many questions coming in about the issue of gender. And I think Betty Skinner, a graduate student at the Balsillie School, summarizes many of these questions well when he asks, on the topic of women, do you imagine that more women in power would result in less wars being fought or less lethal wars?
It's a question I often get asked, and I can't be all that optimistic. You know, I'm not sure that women in power necessarily will behave differently from men in power when they're faced with a warlike situation. It may be that women have a different style of leadership, and we're possibly seeing this with the pandemic, that women tend to be more consensual, perhaps, and tend to operate in a more collegial way. That may be cultural or maybe societal, I don't know. But when women are in power, I think they can often be every bit as prone to get involved in wars as men can. So let me just name a few. Catherine the Great, who presided over a great many wars and expanded Russia's borders, Maria Theresa, more recently Margaret Thatcher, Golda Meir in Israel, Indira Gandhi in India. I'm not sure, unfortunately, that women in power are necessarily going to keep countries out of war.
I have a question from Douglas Baba, combined with another question coming in from an African student. In Margaret MacMillan's view, or they would like to ask your view on wars in Africa. Are they more culturally and ethnically embedded than politically influenced, especially in cases of DR Congo, South Sudan, Somalia, and what's going on now in Ethiopia? And related to this has been a question on the future of guerrilla warfare. What makes modern day guerrilla warfare successful?
And I think the wars in Africa are probably, like a lot of wars, mixed motives. I've talked to someone here in Africa who's looked at a number of the wars in Angola and Mozambique, and he's argued, and I tend to accept his argument because he makes it very well, that the wars will be a combination of drawing on ethnic loyalties perhaps, but they will also have political motivations, and they'll also sometimes include criminal motivations. So you will get peoples who have a base in a particular ethnic community, who want to, steal things perhaps, or get control of the diamond trade or whatever, but will also have political objectives. And so I think it's often difficult to sort out. The motives will often be mixed up with each other. What clearly happens is that war becomes more likely when you have a failed state. When you have a state that's unable to hold the ring, you then get those who are strong enough and ruthless enough rising to the surface. Guerrilla war, yes, well, of course, we still have the guerrilla war. The word comes from Spanish, the little war. It's asymmetrical war. It's war of those who don't have huge armed forces against those who do. It's wars of those who are weaker against a much greater power. And the idea is to just attack them when they're weak. If some soldiers get separated from the main force of the army, as in the Spanish guerrilla war in the beginning of the 19th century, then you kill those soldiers or you surround those soldiers, but you never take on the main force of the enemy. And yes, we still have guerrilla war in Afghanistan. We still have guerrilla war in parts of Africa. What I think is more and more likely, and again, the military are very much focused on this, is urban war, because so many of us are now living in huge urban agglomerations. And there are certainly parts of the world where parts of cities are now out of control of the authorities and under the control of really the equivalent of local warlords.
I have a question on the biggest lessons that we can learn from war. What are, hopefully some helpful lessons moving forward?
Well, I suppose among the lessons I would suggest is be aware that wars can happen by accident. Don't think you can control war, because war becomes uncontrollable very, very quickly indeed. I mean, I think one of the most dangerous expressions is we're going to fight a neat, limited war, or we're going to carry out a surgical military action. And those often run out of control. And I think that's something worth remembering. You never know where a war is going to take you. You never know what the damage will be, and you may not be able to control it in the end. And I think the other thing that's very important is that you have to think about ways of preventing war. You have to think about ways of understanding those who might be hostile to you, or you might be hostile to them. I think you have to try and reassure them. That's where you need diplomacy, you need knowledge, you need to know about the others you're dealing with, because if you don't know anything about them, you'll tend to assume the worst, and they'll tend to assume the worst of you. And so I think constant negotiation, constant dealing with others, and constantly trying to build a regime that makes war more difficult. It's not easy, and it takes the will and the cooperation of the world's great powers as well as middle powers like Canada, but it can be done. And I think we've seen that we can have peace. And there are parts of the world, if you look at Europe, considering its hideous century of the 20th century, you look at Europe today, a major war is unthinkable. And so we can build peace, but not easy.
And one last question from Jill Sinclair. Please tell us what you think of the adage, if you want peace, prepare for war.
Well, there's something in it, isn't there? You know, we know that deterrence can be very effective in trying to prevent people from fighting. And, you know, we look back in history at what happened in the 1930s when the Western democracies didn't want to spend a lot of money on weapons, didn't want to contemplate another war. And that tended to give an opening for those who did want a war and who did contemplate another war. So I'm afraid, yes, I think you probably should prepare for war, but it's very difficult to do in peacetime in democracies because voters and taxpayers say quite reasonably, why are we spending money on all this stuff when we don't really need it? So it's a problem.
Professor MacMillan, thank you for that. I would like for you to now read out the 3 names that have been drawn from our randomized book draw using the audience email addresses, which have now been shared with you.
Okay.
The 3 individuals will receive copies of your new award-winning book, War, How Conflict Shaped Us.
Well, that's very nice of you to do that. And the winners are, in no particular order, I've just got 3 names here, Kestrel DeMarco, Douglas Baba, and Tamara Lawrence. I hope you enjoy it.
Wonderful, thank you.
Well, congratulations to our book winners, and thank you so much, Dr. MacMillan, for that very interesting talk. It really struck me that you showed in the conversation today the ways in which studying war can illuminate so many issues that we're interested in here at the Balsillie School, from science and technology to gender, memory and trauma, colonialism, climate change. And that doesn't even take into account the things that we normally think of as being part of war studies, like diplomacy and strategy, which of course you also talked about. But I also really, really appreciated your broad historical perspective, because that, I think, actually brought us a little bit of optimism. I mean, you finished your talk by saying that you still think that it is possible for us to end war, at least on a regional basis. And I really do think that it's that historical perspective that helps us to come to that optimism that we can sometimes get bogged down in the difficulty of solving these problems in the moment. And so thank you again for delivering this inaugural Balsillie lecture. And we hope you'll come back in person sometime to the Balsillie School.
Thank you so much. That was Dr. Veronica Kitchen from University of Waterloo, also faculty at the Balsillie School, someone who was mentored by Professor Margaret MacMillan during her time as a graduate student at University of Toronto. And it's on me now only to thank all of you in the audience. Thank you very, very kindly once again to Professor MacMillan for that very insightful and wonderful hour spent listening to her. Thank you for everybody who joined us today for this special inaugural Balsillie address. We look forward to seeing all of you again soon in person. Until then, take care and stay safe.